One reckless decision, two children killed, and a father left with grief that would never end. But years later, inside a maximum security prison, something no one expected took place. The father sat face to face with the man who killed his son and forgave him. Why? Why would a grieving parent show mercy to the very person responsible for their worst nightmare? And what did the killer say when the two men finally met? This is not just the story of a crime. It's the story of what happens when unimaginable loss collides with an equally unimaginable choice. It was late afternoon on Sunday, June 14, 2015. The sun still high, the air filled with the sound of kids playing outside. 5 children walked together toward a corner shop for ice cream. It was routine, ordinary. But at the intersection of Maple and 3rd, everything changed. A car blew through a red light at nearly 70 miles an hour. Witnesses described it as a blur of metal, too fast for anyone to react. The impact was immediate and brutal. 2 children were thrown across the road. Others lay crumpled on the asphalt. Neighbors ran from porches. One woman told police, "I heard the tires, then silence, then screaming." Another man who rushed to help said, "You don't forget what you see. Shoes in the street, a backpack torn open, and the sound of a father screaming for his son." Sirens followed within minutes, but for 2 of the children, it was already too late. Among the dead was 8-year-old Jacob Thompson. His father later described him as bright, mischievous, and inseparable from his younger sister, the kind of kid who could turn a bad day into a good one just by walking in the room. What began as an ordinary walk to buy ice cream ended as the worst day of their lives. The man behind the wheel was Ryan Mitchell, 27 years old. He wasn't a career criminal, he had no violent record. To neighbors, he was just another young man working odd jobs, someone who drank on weekends but never stood out. But that day, he got behind the wheel drunk. His blood alcohol content was twice the legal limit, and toxicology later revealed traces of cocaine. At the scene, officers found him stumbling, shirt stained with spilled beer, hands trembling as he leaned against the car. One witness told police, "He just sat down on the curb staring at the ground. Then he started saying over and over, 'Oh God, what have I done?'" Another recalled, "I thought he was going to run, but instead, he collapsed. He looked like he already knew his life was over." Paramedics didn't need to check. They could smell the alcohol on him before he spoke. Police put him through a roadside test. He failed within seconds. That night, Ryan Mitchell was booked and charged with multiple counts of vehicular manslaughter. The mugshot shows him with red eyes, jaw clenched, and what looks less like anger than shock. Shock at what his recklessness had just destroyed. For the Thompson family and for the others, the days that followed were unendurable. The funerals came quickly, held within the same week. In church halls and community centers, families sat in silence, staring at photographs of smiling children now framed in black. Coffins far too small were lowered into the ground. The sound of shovels hitting dirt was followed only by muffled sobs. The community gathered in disbelief. Neighbors left flowers at the intersection where the crash happened. Balloons, teddy bears, and handwritten notes turned the corner into a memorial. Parents held their own children closer, suddenly aware of how fragile a single walk across the street could be. Reporters asked the same question they always ask in these moments: how do you go on? But there is no answer that fits. Because how do you rebuild a life when its center is missing? How do you return to work, cook dinner, or pay bills when the sound of an empty bedroom waits in the background? For Mark Thompson, father of 8-year-old Jacob, the silence was unbearable. He did not speak to the press. He did not make statements. There were no words for what he felt. Because how do you go on when the life you built your days around is gone in seconds? The trial opened 6 months after the crash. The courtroom was filled with family members, reporters, and a jury already aware of the case through headlines. Prosecutors described Ryan Mitchell as reckless, selfish, and unfit to be behind the wheel. They laid out the timeline with precision. The drinks he consumed that afternoon, the drugs in his system, the speed of the vehicle, the red light he ignored. Every fact was anchored by evidence. CCTV footage was played for the jury. It showed the moment Mitchell's vehicle tore through the intersection, a blur against the static rhythm of cross traffic. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Parents turned away. Others covered their faces. Then came the toxicology reports. Blood alcohol level twice the legal limit, traces of cocaine. The science left no room for argument. Finally, the prosecution showed the aftermath. Photographs and body cam footage captured the scene seconds after the crash. Images too graphic for public release, but enough to leave jurors visibly shaken. Some stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the screen. Others exhaled sharply as though trying to steady themselves. Mitchell sat silent at the defense table. He offered no dispute. Through his attorney, he entered a guilty plea to multiple counts of vehicular manslaughter. There was no defense that could erase the evidence, no argument that could lessen the reality of 2 children dead. The only question left was how many years he would serve. Victim impact statements filled the courtroom. Parents described birthdays that would never come, siblings waking up screaming in the night, the hollow sound of an empty chair at dinner. Each statement was read slowly, the weight of grief sinking deeper into the room. The judge listened. Then came the sentence, 20 years in a state prison. For the families, it was justice on paper, but no sentence could balance what was lost. The children were gone, and no number of years would ever change that. Ryan Mitchell's first years in prison were volatile. Inmates knew his charges, and in prison culture, crimes involving children carry their own sentence. He was targeted with threats, insults, and on more than one occasion, violence. For his own safety, he was placed in protective custody, a form of isolation where interaction is tightly controlled. Days became long stretches of silence, broken only by guards making rounds. Months later, once tensions cooled, Mitchell was transferred to a quieter unit. There, life settled into the relentless rhythm of incarceration. Wake up at 6 o'clock a.m., head count. Breakfast. Hours locked in a cell barely large enough to pace. Lunch served on a tray through a slot in the door. Yard time in a concrete pen, always under watch. 17 hours a day spent inside a box of concrete and steel. A bed bolted to the wall, a small desk, a shelf with state-issued books. That was his world. Prison records describe Mitchell as disciplined, withdrawn, and almost obsessively neat. His cell was always clean, clothes folded with precision, every item lined up exactly where it belonged. Some officers saw this as coping, others read it as control, a way of imposing order where he had none. But there was one detail in those records that stood out. Unlike most inmates, Mitchell signed up for grief counseling, not anger management, not substance abuse therapy. Grief counseling. It wasn't mandated by the court. It wasn't required for parole. It was something he asked for himself. Week after week, he attended sessions in the prison chapel, sitting quietly among other men, listening more than speaking. Was it genuine remorse? A man truly broken by what he had done? Or was it an attempt at redemption, a way to appear reformed in the eyes of future parole boards? That question has no easy answer, and it's one that would resurface years later when Mitchell came face to face with the man who had lost the most. While Ryan Mitchell began serving his sentence, Mark Thompson was left with the far harder task, learning to live without his son. He went back to work as a construction foreman. Outwardly, life appeared to return to routine. He was on job sites at dawn, hard hat on, giving instructions to crews. He coached his surviving daughter's soccer team on weekends, pacing the sidelines, cheering when she scored. He smiled at neighbors when he could, waved when passing cars slowed in sympathy. But grief doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't ease just because the world expects it to. For Mark, the pain came in waves, sharp and sudden, sometimes on the quietest days. Birthdays, anniversaries, the first Christmas without Jacob, the first day of school when his daughter went alone. At the dinner table, one chair was always empty. No matter how much food was served, the silence where his son's voice once was hung heavier than the meal. Family photographs became painful reminders. In every frame, Jacob's absence seemed louder than the presence of anyone else. And yet, Mark carried on. Not because he was healed, but because he had to, for his daughter, for his wife, for the fragments of life still left standing. Years later, when a journalist asked him how he survived, Mark's answer was simple but devastating. "I lost my son, and when you lose a child, you lose a part of yourself too." He never spoke publicly of hatred toward Ryan Mitchell, but he never denied the depth of his pain. His silence, to many, spoke louder than anger. 5 years after the crash, Mark Thompson received an unexpected call. Corrective Services had launched a restorative justice program, a controversial initiative allowing victims' families to meet face-to-face with offenders. The idea was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. Create a space where victims could ask the questions that haunted them, hear answers directly from the person responsible, and sometimes find a way to forgive. Participation was voluntary. No reduced sentences, no parole deals, just dialogue. Most parents approached with the offer refused outright. For them, the idea of sitting across from the person who killed their child was unthinkable. They chose distance, silence, walls between their grief and the man behind it. But Mark Thompson said yes. The decision stunned even his own family. Why put himself through it? Why give the man who destroyed his life another moment of his time? Mark's explanation was quiet but unwavering. "I didn't want hate to be the only thing I had left of my son's memory." For Mark, the choice wasn't about absolution. It wasn't about erasing blame. It was about survival. Living year after year consumed by rage had left him hollow. He wanted to reclaim some part of himself, not for Mitchell, but for Jacob, and for the daughter who still needed her father present, not broken. Before the meeting could happen, both men underwent extensive psychological evaluation. Officials had to be sure it wouldn't do more harm than good. Therapists warned Mark that forgiveness, if it came at all, would not be clean or easy. For Mitchell, the preparation was different. He would have to confront the consequences of his actions not in headlines or reports, but in the eyes of the father he had devastated. The stage was set for something rare, something dangerous, something almost unheard of. Mark Thompson, a grieving father, was about to walk into a prison and face the man who killed his child. The meeting was arranged inside a maximum security prison, not in a courtroom, not through glass, but in a neutral room designed for the restorative justice program. A table, 2 chairs, a guard stationed at the door, the kind of space where silence feels louder than words. Mark Thompson entered first. For 5 years, he had imagined this moment. He pictured anger. He pictured shouting. At times, he pictured lunging across the table, even if it meant being restrained. And yet, when he stepped into the room, none of those emotions came. Instead, it was something heavier, a weight in his chest. The feeling of carrying not just his grief, but the presence of his son's memory into the room with him. He sat down, his hands folded tightly, his eyes fixed on the door. Moments later, it opened. Ryan Mitchell was brought in, shackled at the wrists, escorted by 2 correctional officers. His head was lowered, shoulders slumped. It was not the same man from the mugshot years earlier. Prison had aged him, lines deeper, eyes darker. The officers unshackled him and stepped back. He took the seat across from Mark. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Mark was the one to break it, his voice low, steady, but edged with years of pain. "You killed my boy." Mitchell finally looked up. Tears were already gathering in his eyes. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for it." For a second, time seemed suspended. 2 men, one broken by loss, the other broken by guilt, sitting only a few feet apart. In that room, there were no lawyers, no judges, no jury, only the raw, unfiltered truth of what had happened on that summer afternoon, and the question of what would come next. What happened next is what makes this story extraordinary. Mark Thompson did not raise his voice. He did not curse. He did not lunge across the table in rage, though no one would have blamed him if he had. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice steady but heavy with years of grief. "I can't carry this hate anymore," he said. It's crushing me. If I don't forgive you, it kills me too." The room went silent. Even the guard at the door stood frozen. Ryan Mitchell broke down. First his shoulders shook. Then the tears came hard, years of remorse and prison silence spilling out all at once. Guards later described him as sobbing uncontrollably. Here was a man who had killed 2 children by his reckless choice. A man who had replayed that day in his head every night from inside a cell. And now he was confronted not with fury, but with forgiveness, from the one man whose anger would have been justified above all others. For years, Mitchell had carried guilt like a sentence heavier than his prison term. In that room, for the first time, someone allowed him to put it down. And yet, the mercy he received was the very thing he knew he least deserved. True crime fans may be asking the same question the program's counselors asked. How? How could a father forgive the man who killed his child? The answer isn't neat. It isn't universal. Forgiveness didn't erase the crime. It didn't mean Jacob's death mattered less. It didn't mean Mitchell's guilt had vanished. Mark explained it simply. Forgiveness was survival. "Hate will hollow you out," he said later. "It doesn't punish the person who hurt you. It punishes you. And I couldn't let that be all my daughter saw in me." Forgiveness, for him, was not about Mitchell. It was about Jacob, about his surviving daughter, about choosing to live in a world that still had meaning instead of drowning in bitterness. "It wasn't for him," Mark said. "It was for me, and for my daughter who's still here. She deserves a father who's not broken by anger." In that moment, Mark Thompson made a choice few people ever could: to carry his son's memory not as a weapon, but as a reason to let go of hate. News of the forgiveness spread quickly. The prison program had been small, almost experimental, but this meeting made headlines. Some praised Mark Thompson as saint-like, a man of extraordinary strength who had chosen compassion over vengeance. Editorials called his act a beacon of humanity in the darkest of places. Others were less charitable. They accused him of weakness. They said no parent should ever offer mercy to the person responsible for their child's death. Talk radio lit up with callers asking, "Would you forgive? Could you forgive?" Letters poured in. Some were written by strangers who had lost children of their own, thanking Mark for showing them that forgiveness might one day be possible. Others condemned him, insisting he had betrayed the memory of his son. And maybe both sides were right in their own way. Because forgiveness is not a formula. It is not a duty. It cannot be demanded, and it cannot be measured. Forgiveness is a decision, messy, imperfect, personal. For Ryan Mitchell, it meant something he hadn't expected: hope. He told the program's coordinator, "For the first time since that day, I feel like I might be able to make something right." But let's be clear, forgiveness did not shorten Mitchell's time. His sentence remained unchanged. 20 years, with years still ahead before parole. No program, no public sympathy could erase the weight of that judgment. And Mitchell himself never asked for it. "Punishment is fair," he said during a prison interview. "I earned it. Every day I wake up here, I know why. But that forgiveness, he didn't owe me that. He gave me something I can never repay." For him, the cell doors still clanged shut every night. The lights still flicked off at 10 p.m. He still woke each morning to the sound of guards shouting head counts. Forgiveness did not free him from prison, but it freed him from something else: the belief that his life was beyond redemption. So what do we make of this? In most true crime stories, we focus on the act itself: the crime scene, the evidence, the blood on the pavement. Then comes the trial, the verdict, the sentence, and usually that's where the story ends. But this case doesn't end there. It forces us to look at what comes after. What happens when the person who should hate you the most chooses mercy instead? What happens when justice, which we often picture as punishment, intersects with forgiveness, which asks us to release anger? For Ryan Mitchell, that moment of forgiveness tore open the walls he had built around himself in prison. Guilt doesn't disappear, but when the father of the child you killed tells you he no longer hates you, how does the human psyche process that? Does it lift you, or does it make the weight even heavier? For Mark Thompson, forgiveness was not a victory. It wasn't peace in a tidy sense, it was a choice to survive. Carrying hate day after day had become another kind of prison, one that threatened to swallow what was left of his life. For him, forgiveness was not about erasing Jacob's death. It was about refusing to let anger consume his daughter's future as well. So the questions linger. Is forgiveness the strongest form of justice? Or is it something beyond justice entirely? Something that stands apart from courts and sentences, something that belongs only to the human heart? The crash took 2 children's lives. Nothing will ever bring them back. No apology, no verdict, no prison sentence will ever fill the empty chairs left behind. But years later, inside a maximum security prison, a grieving father and a remorseful killer sat across from each other and did something almost unheard of. They reached across the divide between hate and mercy. And in that moment, tragedy gave way to something else. Not closure, not healing, not entirely, but a reminder. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of crime and punishment, even where death and guilt seem absolute, forgiveness can still exist. And maybe for those willing to see it, that forgiveness is its own kind of justice.